Parallel Journeys, Chapter 17, Decline, Fall, and Capture. After the fighting in Bitburg, I went back to Wittlich to await my next orders. There was no doubt in my mind my Moselland was lost. Within 2 days, my hometown would be under attack by the American Third Army. Still, the idea of defeat, of surrender, was unthinkable to me. Deep down, I breathed a sigh of relief when my orders came from the Luftwaffe. I was to report at once to an airbase near Frankfurt. No longer did I hold any dream of flying. I was just glad to be leaving Wittlich before it was attacked. Trier, a city only 20 miles away, had just fallen to the Americans. Wittlich was the next town of any size in its path. Without saying goodbye to his grandmother, Alphonse caught a ride on a Wehrmacht supply truck, headed toward the Rhine River. The Rhine was Germany's river of fate. Throughout history, it had served as an awesome natural barrier against enemy attacks. Now the Rhine had again become a major point of defense. If German soldiers were going to stop the American Third Army, it would have to be here, at the Rhine. This was the critical point, and now was the critical time, Germany's last chance. As he headed toward Frankfurt, Alphonse convinced himself that German troops would rally at the Rhine. Field Marshal Model, the officer in charge, had a reputation for turning nearly hopeless situations into victory. Deutschland über all. Surely it was still possible. During the night, we passed through 4 SS Field Police checkpoints. At each point, our papers were carefully examined. Guards wanted to be sure we were following orders, not deserting. It took a lot of talk before one scar-faced lieutenant finally believed me. All right, he grumbled at last, but you can't imagine how many cowards are trying to fake orders to get away from the fighting. Look over there. I followed the beam of his flashlight to a tree. From its lower branch dangled the bodies of 2 Wehrmacht soldiers, about my age, in their green uniforms. They had been shot in the neck and hanged. The signs pinned to their chests read, "Deserter." More and more German soldiers were deserting. On March 3rd, all teenage boys 15 and older were ordered to the front lines. There, in the fiercest of the fighting, panic overwhelmed many of them, and they followed their urge to turn and run. Officers had orders to shoot on sight anyone caught deserting during battle, regardless of age. But fortunately, many Hitler Youth leaders saw that their boys faced impossible odds. Forcing them to fight against those odds was simply suicide, so they ignored the orders to shoot deserters. Had they followed it, many more German teenagers would have died. The west bank of the Rhine, north of the Mosel River, was in chaos. In the past 3 weeks, the Allies had taken 66,000 prisoners. Some German soldiers had fled to the east bank, but no officers were allowed leave. They had orders to stay and defend the gateway to the German heartland or die trying. On March 5th, in a last, desperate effort to keep the Allies out of the fatherland, German troops began blowing up bridges across the Rhine. The effort was useless. Everywhere along the route to Frankfurt, Alphonse saw German troops in shambles. The soldiers looked dirty, disorganized, and defeated. When he compared them to the mighty Wehrmacht of 1940, he was seized with sorrow and dread. Yet when he reached the airbase at Frankfurt, he found it clean and stocked with plenty of good food and wine. The officers and men seemed businesslike and organized. He was pleased and proud to be part of the Luftwaffe. The feeling didn't last long. When he reported in for duty, the major looked up curiously at him. "What am I supposed to do with you?" he asked, pulling out my file. "You don't think we're going to train you on some aircraft, I hope. Berlin has ordered us to send every available man to the Rhine. Soon we'll all be out in the front line. Von Rick, are you aware of that? It's 5 minutes past 12 on the clock of Germany, you know." The two talked a few minutes, and the officer dismissed Alphonse with the order to report the next day. Promptly at 6 o'clock the following morning, he was awakened with the news that a job had been found for him. On a map, the officer pointed to a town called Spang in the Wittlich region. "Do you know the area, Heck?" he asked. Alphonse assured him that he knew it like the back of his hand. "Terrific. I'm going to send you there. We've got to save some very expensive radar equipment from the Amis. They're just about 5 miles west of Spang now. It could be they'll beat us to it. It's a tricky assignment, but it's worth a shot." Suddenly he stopped staring at his maps and turned to me. "What are you, Heck? 17? "Almost, Air Major." "My God," he said to himself. "What have we done to our children?" Then, handing me my orders, he told me to stop in Wittlich on my way back from Spang. "Take a break there. I'm going to give you 4 days' leave." Leave? I was stunned. Leave was granted only to soldiers whose homes had just been bombed. "But, Air Major," I protested, "we were attacked back on Christmas Eve. My family isn't doing too badly now." "The order stands," he repeated. "I don't want to see you back here until March 11th. Is that clear?" I didn't realize then, but the strange order to take 4 days' leave probably saved my life. Luckily for Alphonse, the major saw what lay ahead. German resistance was crumbling fast. At the Rhine, many troops were trapped by the rapidly advancing American Third Army. Ragged remnants of the Wehrmacht were scrambling hurriedly across the river to the east. By March 11th, the west bank of the Rhine, north of the Mosel River, was completely in Allied hands. Next, the Allies planned to cross the southern Rhine and head into the heart of Germany. Grossdeutschland, the great German Empire, was shrinking like a deflated balloon. Yet even in the face of defeat, Hitler ordered his helpless troops to stand and defend. "Anyone captured without being wounded or without having fought to the limit of his powers has sacrificed his honor," Der Fuhrer announced. "He is expelled from the fellowship of decent and brave soldiers. His dependents will be held responsible." With those words ringing in his ears, Alphonse set out for Spang. When he completed his mission, he headed for home to take his leave as he had been ordered. Village was a ghost town, destroyed in the Christmas Eve air raids. Carefully, I made my way over the wreckage of the bombed out buildings to the gymnasium where I hoped to find a Hitler Youth unit. But there were none left. The only person there was Monica Mohn, a secretary who had stayed behind to burn all the papers of Bonn 244 Wittlich. She looked at me as if I were a ghost. "Nothing is left, Alf," she said flatly. "Our dream of Grossdeutschland is finished. It's merely survival now." Suddenly she started to sob. "God, what's going to happen to us? How could it end like this?" At that moment, I did the unthinkable. I finally accepted Germany's defeat. No longer did I pretend to myself that we could win the war. I pulled Monica to my chest and we clung to each other tightly, the last members of Bond 244. "It was great while it lasted, wasn't it, Alf?" she sobbed. "We almost had the world, didn't we?" I loosened Monica's hands gently, and I prepared to go. As I walked toward the door, I turned back, clicked my heels together, and shouted, "Heil Hitler!" Never again did I say those words. Before Alphonse could reach his aunt's house, the first American artillery shells whistled into Wittlich. The armies had arrived. They were on a relentless march toward the southern Rhine. Wittlich lay right in their path. Earlier that afternoon, as the armies moved nearer, the Wehrmacht had blown up the iron railroad bridge in Wittlich. Minutes later, explosions rocked a larger bridge just a few miles north. The collapse of these bridges would cut Wittlich's railway link to the outside world for the next 4 years. But at that moment, no one cared. As soon as they had destroyed the bridges, German soldiers ran for the hills. Wittlich's few remaining residents huddled in their burned-out homes to await the American army. My aunt and I had our dinner in her kitchen by light of a huge pink-shaded kerosene lamp. "If it makes you feel any better, Aunt Tilly, I'm quite afraid of the Amis," I confessed. "They aren't going to kiss me when they find out I was a Hitler Youth Bondführer." "Who's going to tell them?" she asked. "I burned your uniform already. One day you'll thank me for it." Aunt Tilly was right. The Americans knew that the Hitler Youth were some of the most fanatic Nazis. We would be shown no mercy. At 6 o'clock the next morning, Wittlich was unearthly still. Soon I knew all hell would break loose. I had just finished making coffee when the last attack on the town began. My heart raced. Binoculars pressed to my eyes, I watched from a small window in the gable of the house. The snout of a Sherman tank appeared down the road. It was followed by a dozen more. Behind them were long lines of soldiers, American soldiers. The day of defeat was here. Alphonse was terrified. Pulling on a pair of dirty coveralls and a black suit jacket, he scooped up his Luftwaffe uniform and ran to the chicken coop to bury it. Hoping to make it to the farm, he gave his aunt's house a quick backward glance and hurried out onto the road, now lined with tanks. The one thing I hadn't counted on now happened. Here I was, finally able to face to face with the enemy, and he ignored me. I walked past tank after tank and aroused not the slightest bit of attention. As I turned up the cemetery path, the fastest route to our farm, I realized that the Amis had simply taken me for a child. Other children had been wandering in the street, staring at the tanks. I just looked like one of them. I was relieved, but I wasn't about to press my luck. Just when I thought I had made it, the voice of a soldier stopped me. "Hey you, Kraut," he hollered. "Is there any wine in this dump?" I barely understood his twangy English, and I had no idea what he meant by dump, but at least I knew he didn't want me. There is plenty of wine here, I replied. This is a wine town. Hey, Lieutenant, the soldier yelled. This crowd speaks English. Come with me, the officer said. I speak 3 words of German, and I'm supposed to occupy this town. When I was in school, I never dreamed that learning English would save my life. And yet, suddenly, here I was, Wittlich's last Bondführer, acting as a translator for the American Third Army. Riding down the main street of town in an American Army jeep, a bullhorn held to my mouth, I ordered all German soldiers to come out unarmed, their hands raised in surrender. At the end of 2 hours, 17 bedraggled soldiers had gathered in the street. None of them were officers. The American lieutenant said they would be taken to a POW camp, but Alphonse wasn't so sure. The Amis could very well shoot the soldiers in the nearest forest. Who would care? His next order was to round up the remaining citizens of Wittlich and read them a long set of rules, beginning with a strict curfew. Anyone caught on the street from 6 p.m. to 7 a.m. would be shot on sight. The 80 pathetic figures left in town were then lined up in front of a Sherman tank to face an army photographer. Photos finished, the lieutenant dismissed everyone except Alphonse. When his paperwork was done, he offered to drive Heck home, since it was now past curfew. As Alphonse was getting out of the jeep, the officer grabbed him by the arm. Say, I just realized I don't know a thing about you. You aren't one of those young Nazi werewolves, are you? My heart sank. Under no condition must I mention the Hitler Youth. It would be certain death. I'm on leave from the Luftwaffe, I said as calmly as I could. You're what? He shouted, reaching for his .45 Colt revolver. I carefully pulled out my Luftwaffe identification booklet and opened it to my picture. Geez, he exclaimed. I never thought a kid your age would be an officer. I should have shipped you back to the POW camp with the others. Why didn't you tell me? You never asked, I said smoothly. Motioning for me to stay in the jeep, he turned around and headed back to City Hall, where his men were spending the night. For a long time, I sat in front of the mayor's office all by myself. About 10 p.m., a soldier threw me a blanket, gave me a bottle of wine, and a can of meat. I wondered if this would be my last meal. The next morning, the lieutenant asked Alphonse to look at some papers they had found on the German soldiers. When they were satisfied that the papers contained no top-secret information, the officers gave him some bread, cheese, and coffee. After breakfast, they would leave, they told him. Another group of American soldiers would arrive shortly. Handing Heck a piece of paper, the lieutenant explained, This is an order to turn yourself into the next American unit. There's supposed to be some fighting up where we're going, and I can't afford to drag prisoners along. Alphonse thought about ignoring the order. Perhaps he should destroy the paper and try to make it back to the Luftwaffe base in Frankfurt. But if he were caught, it most likely would mean death. As he pondered his situation, he remembered the warning words of his friend, Lieutenant Hans Levitz, many months earlier. For God's sake, Alf, take life if you're given the choice. Unfortunately, Hans Levitz never had the choice. A colonel for whom he worked had been accused in the July 20th plot to kill Hitler. Levitz's name was found on some papers in the colonel's office, and the Gestapo began tracking him. Although Hans had no knowledge of the assassination plot, and certainly had no part in it, he was shot as a traitor. Without any idea that his friend was dead, Alphonse now remembered Hans's advice. There was no question. He would choose life. He would forget about going to Frankfurt. Afraid and uncertain, he headed back to the lone hut, all that remained of the Heck farm. To his great surprise, he spotted his grandmother outside, crouching amid the rubble in the pouring rainstorm. Oma, I called softly, what are you doing down there? She got up on stiff knees and held out her arms. Frau Brewer told me she saw you with the Amis yesterday. Did they let you go? Only for a while, I said, pulling her close to me. I have to turn myself in to the next unit that comes through, but I don't think they're going to shoot me. Well, of course they won't, she said indignantly. You're just a boy who did what he was told. Oma, I stammered, feeling like a 6-year-old who was about to cry. This is the end of Germany and the end of me. We have lost the war. She loosened her arms and stepped back. Nonsense, boy, she said calmly. We have lost wars before, and it's not going to be the end of you. Go and get some rest. Then turning back to the rubble, she said, Somebody has got to start cleaning up this mess, don't you think, Herr Ex-Bondführer?